Knock knock, who's there? A new millennium. The 2000s marked the 5th decade of Bob Dylan's recording career. Unlike almost everybody else who started recording music in the 1960s, Bob Dylan continued to make career-defining music in the 2000s. This is also the decade in which I started listening to Bob Dylan. The year was 2009. I was an angsty, lonesome 16-year-old, and Bob Dylan's music was nothing short of aesthetic salvation. Like the 1990s, Dylan only released 4 studio albums this decade, so in between them, I'm going to recommend some never-ending tour performances from the 2000s. Lastly, I want to thank those of you who commented ideas for future content on the 1990s tier list video. There's definitely some consensus around additional tier lists, more in-depth Bob Dylan content, and some concepts that I would never have thought of on my own. The upshot of which is there's a lot more content on the way. I'm always open to suggestions, so if you've got ideas for future content, please feel free to leave a comment here as well. And whether you've been following the series or you're new to my channel, I encourage you to like this video and subscribe to my page. Think of each as leaving a form of micro-digital currency in my tip jar. And now, the 2000s. 31. Love and Theft. It's true that Bob Dylan produced most of his best work when he was a very young man. He's alluded to this in certain interviews, that as a younger man, he wrote incredible songs almost effortlessly. The older he got, the more he had to fight for excellence. It's a good lesson for creatives because the older you get, the more you have to fight for what used to come naturally to you. Or as Leonard Cohen put it, I ache in the places where I used to play. Dylan is no exception to that. He is just a man. He continued to fight for it. He continued digging. And every so often he came up with the most fantastic treasure. And Love and Theft is a prime example of that. In Love and Theft, Dylan discovers yet another fresh and unprecedented songwriting poetics. I think you could argue that he began to discover it on Time Out of Mind, but in my listening, Time Out of Mind is the seed of that poetics, and Love and Theft is the fully bloomed plant. It's this melange of imagery that comes from an array of innumerable sources, which include Mark Twain, Charlie Patton, the biography of a Japanese Yakuza boss, Lewis Carroll, the Carter family, the Bible, of course. It feels Faulknerian to me in that it seems like Bob is writing from the subconscious of the American South in the 1930s, and yet also clearly from a modern person's point of view. In there being collages of imagery and influences and references, they seem like these postmodern renderings of the subconscious of the American South in the 1930s, is what I'm going with. I only feel compelled to dig for that kind of term because I am so charmed and intrigued by the lyrics on this album. It fills me with such an appetite to discover and understand their source, where the lifeblood of this album is coming from. This really shows you, in a sense, what popular songwriting could be, and what it so rarely is. Most popular songwriters just don't have this kind of ambition. Tweedledee and Tweedledum is a terrific opener. It's a prime example of how good the guitars on this album always sound. The guitar playing on this album is just tremendous. So much credit is owed to Larry Campbell and Charlie Sexton. Summer Days just makes me smile. Lonesome Day Blues is as good a blues song as he's ever written. High Water is such a beautifully intense song about apocalypse, but not just social apocalypse, but individual apocalypse. The line I always think of is, as great as you are, man, you'll never be greater than yourself. You know, as usual, Bob is not writing about one particular setting or event. He's writing from a sensation and then mapping that sensation onto a lot of different earthly circumstances, one of which is being drowned in your own ego. Moonlight is gorgeous. Po' Boy. Po' Boy is the one song from this album that I like to cover. Cry a While just has such wonderful flights of lyrical fancy that are so characteristic of what makes this album's lyrics so seductive and engrossing. Last night across the alley, I heard a banging on the wall. Must have been Doc Pasquale making a 2 a.m. booty call. I mean, just who had booty call on their bingo card for Bob Dylan lyrics? Not I. I could and probably will do a deeper dive into some of these songs at some point, but suffice to say, Bob found himself in such a special poetic place on this album. He suddenly was possessed by the ghost of William Faulkner and did what Faulkner at his best could do, which was render render the subconscious of a controversial stage of America with gravitas and levity and verisimilitude. You feel like you're in someone's head and heart from that era. This will probably be a slightly controversial ranking, but I'm going to put it just above Bringing It All Back Home in the S tier. Yeah, that's how I feel. 32, Modern Times. A good way to situate how I feel about Modern Times relative to its predecessor, Love and Theft, is how I feel about Blonde on Blonde compared to Highway 61 Revisited. In Highway 61 and in Love and Theft, I think Bob crystallized a poetics of popular songwriting that was new under the sun. Obviously, both came from influences which scholars have wasted no shortage of ink in tracing. But in both cases, nobody else was writing popular songs in that way or with such power. And the albums that followed those consummate works are albums that try to do a similar thing slightly less effectively. Not everybody agrees with me that Blonde on Blonde is less effective than Highway 61. Some people do. But that's how I feel about it. But again, we have to put that in perspective. Blonde on Blonde is one of popular music's greatest collections of songs. And I'm sort of splitting hairs of artistic quality when I say that it's less effective than Highway 61, because it's still profoundly effective. And I feel very similarly about Modern Times. It's a slightly dampened rendering of the poetics that he crystallized in Love and Theft. This album is still an excellent work of art. Thunder on the Mountain is another one of his greatest, funniest, most energizing blues songs. Spirit on the Water is also a fascinating song that I can never tell how earnest Spirit on the Water is. It's this love poem of sorts that goes on much longer than you would think a love poem would, and also includes some very dark biblical imagery that seems out of place in a love poem. It's a great example to me of the apparent vibe not necessarily being the essential vibe of the song. When the Deal Goes Down is a song I found very moving when I first discovered this record that over time has worn a little bit thin for me, probably because of lyrics like "we eat and we drink, we feel and we think." Yeah, we do, but Working Man's Blues number 2 has some excellent turns of phrase in it. I sleep in the kitchen with my feet in the hall. Sleep is like a temporary death. Nettie Moore feels like a mortality song that doesn't really reference mortality at all. I think it is just the atmosphere of the song that gives it that quality. Also the sense of love receding. Things one has loved receding. Ain't Talkin' is a great spooky song. The other thing that is at least partially a mark against this album and some of the ones that came after it is that in a couple of cases, Bob is literally just rewriting blues standards. Rowan and Tumblin', Someday Baby, The Levee's Gonna Break. These are just blues songs that already existed. And yet writing credit is given to and exclusively to Bob Dylan. And that feels a little bit bad. And I think, it's not that he didn't write a good new set of lyrics, or that I think that, takes the songs out of the running for being good works of art. But it's like how I feel about some of the blues songs on Blonde. The fact that there is elsewhere on this album such singular originality makes me look at those songs as just slightly lesser. They feel like romps that are part of a lineage, but not necessarily original outgrowths of in the Bob Dylan garden. I am admittedly about half the age that Dylan was when he recorded this. I'd be curious to hear what people older than I am think of this statement. This album feels very much like what it is like to be somebody over the age of 60. Like that there is more to reflect on than could possibly fit into a 3.5-minute pop song. Or that there is a horizon stretching out ahead of you that you will be beyond sooner or later. You're both reassuring yourself and scaring yourself about what might be past it. The ghosts of one's own history and one's own country's history and one's own music genre's history are so numerous and so present that they all show up in what one thinks and writes. Am I on the right track? It is again a work of popular songwriting art, one that I have not tired of listening to despite dozens and dozens of listens. I don't feel as unabashedly enthusiastic about this as I do about Love and Theft, but I like it very much. I would put it just above John Wesley Harding in the A tier. 33, Together Through Life. At last, the first Dylan album that I bought when it was released. It feels like a lot of these songs were written either quickly or by accident. I don't know if that's true, but that's how it sounds, and to some extent your first impression of the album does guide the way you analyze it. If Love and Theft in modern times are like black tie galas where the host has pulled out all the stops, Together Through Life is a little bit like your friend dropping over for a cup of coffee. It's very nice, and you wouldn't have wanted it to have not happened, but it's not the kind of robust beginning, middle, end, new under the sun experience that those other two albums are. Which isn't to say that it doesn't have some really nice highlights. Beyond Here Lies Nothing is quite a good song. Every time I've seen him sing Beyond Here Lies Nothing live, I've been happy that it's happening. Life is Hard is one of Dylan's more musically rich, good songs. Jolene is a good blues song. Other than that, I find most of the songs on this album charming but forgettable. I find the music in If You Ever Go to Houston pretty plodding. Forgetful Heart feels like some of Oh Mercy's weaker material, where it's like, I get what you're saying, but I don't see a lot of depth in what you're saying. Not that somebody who loves you forgetting who you are isn't a deeply moving experience. I just don't find this to be a deeply moving depiction of that experience. The record is charming. It sounds very good for the most part. 2 or 3 of the songs, I'm always happy when I hear them. It's worth mentioning that all these songs were co-written by Bob Dylan and Robert Hunter, who was the Grateful Dead's lyricist. It's almost how I feel about Desire, where it feels like Dylan adjacent. It feels like a sideshow in the Dylan Carnival. I neither hate it nor consider it as offensive as some of his worst albums. I would put it just south of Under the Red Sky in the C tier. 34, Christmas in the Heart. The year 2009 was full of surprises for Bob fans. Together Through Life was a surprise. It was announced only a month before it was released. This album, too, was a surprise. I did rank this album in my Christmas special in late December, but I do want to put it somewhere in the context of his tier list. The point I made in the Christmas video was most of Bob's career feels like he's holding his audience at arm's length, especially like Bringing It All Back Home and After. There's this growing antipathy toward his audience where his audience wants something specific from him. He doesn't want to give them that specific thing. He wants to keep growing and changing. And the dynamic becomes Bob saying, I'm not going to do what you want me to do, but I'm still going to try to create great art. Those have kind of been the terms of engagement for Bob Dylan and Bob Dylan fans throughout his career. If other Dylan albums are him trying to keep you at arm's length, this is Bob inviting you into his living room for mulled wine and gingerbread men. It's a little bit like how you think of We Are the World. The motive for its creation was to generate money for a charitable purpose, not to vaunt its maker as an artistic genius. Through that lens, I consider it a very charming album. It's just funny on some level to hear late career Bob sing Christmas songs. It's sort of charming fish out of water vibes. This is certainly not a defining Christmas album, which again, I don't necessarily think he was even trying for it to be. But it is mostly very sweet and has a few songs that really suit his voice and his predilection for exhuming musical styles of the past. I'll Be Home for Christmas falls into that category. Must Be Santa falls into that category. Little Drummer Boy, I think he does a nice rendition of. Yeah, I mean, his voice is not well suited to all these songs, but it always feels like a sweet holiday gesture. So I would put it just above Saved in his C tier. Bootleg 1, New York, New York, 2002. The fall 2002 leg of the Neverending Tour is one of its absolute best. One of the real charms of the Neverending Tour for a while were the set lists. Bob would play both original songs and cover songs that you really didn't expect him to play. Original songs like Yay Heavy and a Bottle of Bread, which he'd never played before. Cover songs like Brown Sugar, Old Man, or The End of the Innocents. These two shows are prime examples of that. The set lists are fun. The playing on these shows is outrageously good. In particular, the renditions of Summer Days from this leg were simply euphoric. The last noteworthy thing about these shows is that Bob closed the November 13th show with something. The reason for that is that the George Harrison tribute was taking place that night and Bob couldn't be there because of the tour, but wanted to honor his old friend George Harrison, who had passed recently, by covering what is probably his best song. These shows are kind of a consummation of the Neverending Tour, the fun of it, the shock of it, and just the sheer quality of how good the shows could be. Bootleg 2, London, England, November 24th, 2003. There is somewhat of a pattern around Bob tending to pull out some unexpected stops in November. This is largely just a very strong show. He seems very into it and his voice is in excellent form. It's also got a very interesting and surprising set list. He hadn't played Romance in Durango since 1976, and who knows why he brought it out for this show. Tough Mama is a song he played pretty infrequently, not as infrequently, but pretty infrequently. It's a good example of a show that big Bob fans cherish. Being a big Bob fan at a certain point is like playing a kind of exalted form of bingo. You've got a real unlikely song on your card, and when it comes up, you just become exultant. This is a show like that. Bootleg 3, London, England, November 21st, 2005. London again, November again. Another set list peppered with rarities. Open the set with Link Wray's iconic song Rumble. This is the only live rendition of $1 Million Bash, and if memory serves, he cracks up halfway through it because it's just a ridiculous song. And of course, he played a truncated version of London Calling. I think Jacob Dylan, his son who was in the Wallflowers, brought London Calling to Bob's attention. How can you resist Bob Dylan singing London Calling? Bootleg 4, September 19th and 20, 2007. The main thing I just want to call to your attention here is that this is when Jack White and Bob Dylan shared the stage together. My understanding is that Jack White got to choose the songs that they played and chose two real Dylan rarities. One More Cup of Coffee, which he had played a lot in the 70s and then played kind of sporadically since then, and then Outlaw Blues, which he'd never played before. And that's either a great coincidence that Jack White chose two songs that Bob had never played live before, or it's credit to Jack White's intense Bob fandom that he wanted to give big Bob fans some live debuts. That's possible. Either way, it's a really special moment of Bob sort of knighting, if you will, a descendant of his. It's the kind of moment that as a performing singer-songwriter, I know how meaningful that kind of moment would be to somebody like Jack White. And through some kind of intergenerational, interstellar empathy, I just feel really happy for him that he got to have that moment. That's a really, really, really cool moment with one of your heroes. I think the main thing, just to reiterate about Bob's 2000s work, is that he kept digging for and making transcendent works of art. It's further to what I really admire about Bob's recording career, that even into his later years, beyond when he could possibly need the money, he still needed that artistic absolution, if you will, that only comes from writing another great, fresh, original song. We're getting very close to the end of his studio work here. It's been a fun ride. I mean, we still have a little bit to go, but it's been a fun ride for me. It's been fun to meet a lot of new people and develop somewhat of an audience for this kind of commentary that I didn't have before. So thank you to everybody who is new here. Thank you to everybody who has been following the series. If you enjoyed this, I would appreciate the digital tip of you liking the video and subscribing to my page, and I will see you next time.